What's up guys? In today's video, I want to show you guys a game I played recently where me and my opponent were pretty much in an equal position for the entire game and what I did to put myself in a winning position. With that being said, let's get into it. Alright, so the game starts off with the Carl advanced variation, and I play the advanced variation a lot. So by moving the pawn to c5, I am attacking this d4 pawn. My opponent defends, and I always say this, whenever they play pawn to c3, you always want to bring out the knight to c6. Always. So, after a couple of book moves, I decide to trade in the center, and after I reinforce by moving my pawn to e6, my opponent moves their pawn to h3, attacking my light square bishop, and here I just trade off, and this is just a good general rule of thumb for anyone playing the Carl. Always trade off the light square bishop for either a knight or another light square bishop. Your opponent's two pawns in the center on the dark squares, if played correctly, will hinder your opponent, especially at the lower levels. Anyways, I bring my queen out to b6. They reinforce the pawn by bringing out their dark square bishop to e3. I check. After a simple trade of dark square bishops, I trade off the queens. I reinforce my knight here because this file will eventually be open and I know my opponent is going to attack it. So I'm just, moving my rook to c1 or c8, my apologies, for preparation for that. My opponent, plays pawn to a3. I move my knight out attacking this weak pawn here, and now my opponent brings out their light square bishop attacking my knight, trying to stop me from taking this pawn on d4. I castle. I trade off rooks. My opponent... Sorry, I don't trade off rooks. We trade off minor pieces. Now we trade off rooks. And right here, I bring my knight back to e7. And after we trade off rooks, it is simply just a pawn and a knight endgame. I don't know if any of you guys can tell, but my opponent has 9 minutes on the clock, and I also have 9 minutes on the clock. So we played this extremely quickly, and now we have a lot of time to think how to put ourselves in a winning position. So after me and my opponent make some moves, we are both trying to get our kings to the center, but more importantly, we're trying to get it on this c file. So right here, I move my pawn to b6, stopping my opponent from being able to bring their knight in. And that is the most important thing. You do not want their knight to infiltrate you. So after a little bit more moves, I'm slowly able to bring my king to the center of the board here. And right here, my opponent makes a mistake, and I'm simply just cutting off my opponent's squares where they can move their knight. That's the idea here, because even if they were to... They're going to move their pawn to b4. After I take, they take. I simply cut off their pawn from being able to move to attack my knight. My knight is in an extremely strong spot here. The reason being is because I'm attacking both of these pawns. But if my opponent was to move their knight to... Sorry, let me change the color so this makes it a little easier. If my opponent was able to move their knight to a3, they will be attacking this pawn right here. And all I simply need to do is move my knight to a7 to defend the pawn, and because all the pawns are interlocked, it's not like they can move anywhere anyways. My opponent makes a mistake by checking me here. This allows me to get my king in. If we go back 2 moves, we can see that I can't really move my king anywhere, but because these pawns are defending these spaces here. Once my opponent checked me, it allowed me to infiltrate this spot here. But I didn't opt in to do it. I did the other way around. And after a bunch of pawn moves here, my opponent blunders, and this is pretty much game over for my opponent. They allowed me to check by taking the pawn here on d4. And once my opponent's king moves, I then take, they take, and now I attack their knights and their pawn. After I take the pawn, my opponent moves their pawn to g6. So now these two pawns are kind of interlocked. They can't really move, and I'm just in a winning position. I can freely move my king because my knight is not only defending this weak d4 pawn, but it is also attacking this b4 pawn. So my opponent, even though their knight is defending, they can't really afford to force any trades. So after I said that, my opponent forces a trade, and I simply move my knight back and defending this spot and attacking this. My opponent's king does not really have that many options. They can't move here, they can't move here, they can't move here, they can't move here. The only spots that they can move is b3, b2, and c2. And just like that, I converted a pretty much even playing field into a winning position just because my opponent made a simple mistake. That wasn't one of my cleanest games, but I have been working on my end games a little bit because there are so many times where I'm in a 50-50 or a draw sort of like position, and I know that if my opponent makes a mistake, I can capitalize on it. So that's what I've been working on. But with that being said, I am finally 1578. I am super close to 1600, and yeah. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.